We usually start with a blessing, a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. Now, in a moment, I'm going to put our text back up on the screen. But I just wanted, as I said, do a quick review, an introduction. We have been working on a book called Sefer HaMitzvot, the book of mitzvah education, where we said that the author of the book is basically taking various verses, psukim from the Torah, according to the portion of the week, and then listing them in the certain order that the Rambam has done in his book, Sefer HaMitzvot. Okay? And then explaining how those psukim, those individual verses, were developed into a process or a format of halakha, of Jewish mitzvah observance. Okay? And we've looked at some examples previously about aspects of Jewish ethics. The last time we looked at about Sabbath observance, and we've now started a new topic, and that topic is dealing with laws of kashrut. Okay? So as we look at it now, we're going to see that our text is okay, hold on a second. Just trying to get to the right text. Okay, hold on. We'll be right second, just be right back. Either I'm not.
Just try going like, that'll go to the next page. Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so as we get to our topic, okay, so here we are, okay, for number 113, and you can see here that he cited a verse. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And we raised a number of questions addressing this particular verse. Okay? One was the fact that the verse is actually recited 3 times in the Torah. Why did he pick the particular example from the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus? A second question that we ask, when it says in the verse, you should not cook, what does it mean in the Hebrew, lo tivashel? bishul is usually defined, at least rabbinically, as boiling. Does that mean, for example, that that is the only kind of cooking where there is a prohibition? What about roasting, for example? What about frying? Okay. Let's take another example of the questions. It said you shall not cook a kid, lo tevashel gedi. Why did it specifically refer to a kid? Does that imply generically, are we talking about any kind of kosher animal? Must it be a domestic animal? What about non-domestic animals? And another item is when it refers to its mother's milk in the verse. Okay, what is the kind of milk that we're talking about? Is it specifically cow's milk? What about the milk of some other animal? Okay, so these are the kinds of questions that Chazal, that the rabbis in the Talmud, okay, and others would ask if we see when a verse is discussed. Our author here in Sefer HaMitzvot, has chosen to, so to speak, jump ahead and try to summarize for us some of these discussions. And that's what he's doing here in this section. So I don't know if I can make it any larger for you, but he's pointing out, he says that the verse comes to forbid eating or deriving benefit from meat and milk. Okay? Where does he get the fact that where the verse only specifically says cooking, however form that might be, how does he derive a prohibition of benefit in that regard? Okay? And so what he does is he wants us to understand, and he tells us clearly, for the answer to that, it is because the ban on eating it was made a new law, what we call a chidush, right? Conceptually deriving a brand new conceptual idea that is of a legal nature. And in doing so, why? Because he says it's different from other forbidden foods. Let's take an example. Okay? We know that there are certain animals from the Torah that are forbidden to be eaten. Okay? We know that certain aspects of a kosher animal, if it's not slaughtered properly, it is not possible to be eaten. Okay? So those would be clear examples, okay, of forbidden foods. But here he wants us to understand that this chidush, this new idea, this new concept, is that we're taking two items that are normally considered to be viable, valid, almost kosher, a piece of meat from a domestic animal, and milk from a domestic animal, each in and of itself would be permitted if appropriate, but it's when you put them together and you cook them, and he says in a moment, derive benefit from that mixture, that is where it is prohibited. Now, how does he tell us that? In the next line, he says, without other forbidden foods, he wants to tell us there is no guilt unless one benefited by eating them. Okay? Take a non-kosher piece of meat. Okay? One is transgressing the law if they eat that piece of meat. Okay? However, he says, that means you're going to eat it in the normal method. Okay? What happens, however, if you've consumed, okay, in this case, in a non-normal method? Let's say instead of cutting up the meat and eating it normally, you digest the meat, the piece of meat, all in one piece. Okay? Or instead of cooking it, a piece of meat relatively at a normal temperature, it's still burning hot. And then you consume it, and because it's so hot, you swallow it, and you don't have time to enjoy it.
Oh, okay.
So what he's trying to tell us here, again, is that here, even if one did not benefit by eating it, and he gives the example while swallowing it, even if he should swallow it hot, burning his throat, and that he has no enjoyment or benefit from it all, he is to be given whiplashes. In other words, whiplashes is his explanation of what the rabbis call flogging, malkot. And that's a situation, if one has done it, bemazed, on purpose. So what we see is that each item separately may be acceptable. However, what is prohibited is not only their being cooked together, but also being enjoyed together, deriving benefit from the combination, even if not done by eating. So let's take an example, which we'll come back to later. Okay? Let's say one takes this piece of meat, cooks it in milk, and uses it as a poultice, as something to put on a wound, like a bandage. Okay. Is that forbidden? The person is still deriving benefit from it because they're going to feel better. And so perhaps here too, this prohibition of meat and milk would apply to that situation. Okay. Let's take a modern day example very briefly. Okay. I have a dog, not really, but let's say were I to have a dog and I decide, gee, I've got some leftover hamburger meat from a previous dinner. I put it in the dog's bowl and I pour some milk over that hamburger for the dog to eat. Is that acceptable? After all, the dog eating that mixture of milk and meat is going to benefit, as I will benefit by having a fed and healthy animal. Is that prohibited? So we begin to see that the prohibition of meat and milk really is a chidush, as he wants us to understand it, a new law. Okay? And the question then is, where did he derive this from? That the prohibition applies both to the consumption, the eating, and the benefit. Well, in our text, he says it's cited in Psachim 25a. So let me share that example with you. Okay? There happens to be a discussion there about chametz. Okay? And whether certain kinds of chametz approaching Pesach is forbidden. But in that discussion, okay, they try to make a comparison to certain other elements, one of which is the carcass of a dead animal. Okay? But then, fourth generation scholar Abaye tells us as follows. And Abaye maintains that it is for this very reason that the Torah did not write consumption. In other words, did not say simply you should not eat a kid in its mother's milk, okay? But instead tells us, as the verse says, okay, that you should not cook the animal, the kid in its mother's milk. It comes to tell us, says Abaye in the Talmud, that one incurs malkos, lashes or flagellation, excuse me, on its account, even if he enjoys the meat cooked in milk, not in the normal manner of deriving its benefit. So he's given us a definition of what is the law at first. Okay? Now, as we go on, okay, he wants us to understand, our author, that there are more details to this aspect. For example, he wants us to see here that, and discusses one of the questions we asked when it said about cooking, did it apply only to boiling? What about roasting? Things like that. And so here, on the top of this page, we can see, again, he said that according to the sages, in other words, the scholars of the Talmud, the rabbis, that the reason, there we go, why the prohibition against boiling is written 3 times is that it is to teach a ban against eating it, a ban against boiling it, which we were calling cooking, and again, a ban against benefiting from it. Okay? And he tells us that's also a source from the Talmud. Okay? In the Gemara of Cholin, okay, we find the following. The Bei Rabbi Yishmael, the Academy of Rabbi Yishmael teaches, Lo tivashel gedi b'chalev imo, should not cook a calf in its mother's milk, shlosha pa'amim, 3 times. Echad le'isur achila, 1 for the prohibition of eating, ve'echad le'isur hana'ah, 1 for the prohibition of benefit, ve'echad le'isur bishul, and 1 for the prohibition of cooking. Okay? Just a little different order than what our author wrote. Okay? Now, proceeding from here, okay, we can see that he goes on, but still hasn't proven to us where there is a prohibition about eating. How can we say at the same time it's also a prohibition of benefiting? And that's the question, the issue really, that he tries to discuss in the next section of his material, where he again refers this time once more to the Talmud in the Psachim, and Tractate Psachim, where he again points out, sages of blessed memory said. Okay, and then he says, when it says in Scripture, you shall not eat, in the singular or plural, it implies a ban on eating and a ban on deriving benefit are equally meant. Now, his source here is in, again, Gemara, Tractate Psachim, okay? Once more, where there is a discussion primarily about aspects of chametz, okay, and deriving benefit from chametz during Passover. Okay? But he cites again, following discussion. And according to Chizkiyahu's interpretation, This disagrees with the view of Rabbi Abahu, because Rabbi Abahu says, wherever it is stated in Scripture, one shall not eat, or you, singular, shall not eat, or you, plural, shall not eat, both the prohibition against eating and the prohibition against deriving benefit are indicated, unless Scripture specifies for you otherwise. So he derives from this teaching of Rabbi Abahu that the Torah implies both prohibitions when it generally simply may have written the word you should not eat. Okay? But again, we came back to one of our original questions. Our verse did not say that. Our verse simply said you shouldn't cook.
Okay.
And so what does he do? He comes back to try to tell us. For the Torah expresses all derivations of benefit, generally in terms of eating, since it is a constant form of benefit for a man. And that's how he implies that. Following, now you might seize upon me with the question, like we asked. In that case, why were there 3 injunctions written, since 2 would have been enough? According to what I have stated, the answer can be given you that certainly, if it were written in one instance, you shall not boil, that would teach about the prohibition against boiling. And another verse we would need, you shall not eat, which comprises the ban on deriving benefit in eating it. So he said, he's telling us, perhaps one would have thought that the Torah would have had 2 separate verses, one to prohibit cooking, one to prohibit eating, eating. Or perhaps 2 verses, one to prohibit eating, one to prohibit benefit. Okay? But he comes to the conclusion, is that he wants to tell us that clearly here, you shall not eat, which comprise a ban on deriving benefit and eating it, which was the explanation given by Rabbi Abahu from the Talmud. And that would be the case. So that's why, he's basing the fact and saying our verse, since it said 3 times, the very same verse can be interpreted to apply to prohibitions regarding eating, cooking, and deriving benefit. Now, having pointed that out, that still didn't answer all of our initial questions about the verse. So let's go down here. What else could we ask? But why did the merciful God not write, you shall not eat? And he tells us the answer. Scripture should not mention the term eating, as guilt is incurred for this even if eaten in a manner unlike its usual way of enjoyment and benefit. In other words, that's we said was the chidush, the new idea here, that even if it wasn't enjoyed, eaten in the normal manner. And that being the case, one is for a ban on eating, one for a ban on benefiting, and one for a ban on boiling. Their meaning was not that the 3rd verse should denote a 3rd negative precept, but that it was needed for us to learn from it about deriving benefit. So he's answered the question, number 1, of why the verse is found 3 times. He's answered us the question Why does it say, okay, his foundation verse, why did it talk about cooking? Because his implication is from cooking you would eat it, and therefore by saying cooking, it includes the prohibition of both eating and deriving benefit. We still, however, are left with one or two of our other original questions. What about the issue of the kid? What kind of animal is permitted or prohibited? Things like that. Well, in attempting to focus on that possibility, okay, he goes on in our next page, okay, to tell us some of the laws. And it's here where we see that he clarifies that topic for us. That by the law of the Torah, the prohibition on meat and milk applies only to the flesh of a pure, let's translate that as kosher, permissible domestic animal, but not an unclean, in other words, unkosher, forbidden kind of domestic animal, nor a wild animal, even if it's pure, permissible, not a fowl, whether pure or unclean, in other words, kosher or non-kosher. Okay? Now, would it be helpful if he cited the sages on this topic as well? Absolutely. Okay? And that's what he continues. He tells us, hence the interpretation was given for it, a kid, not an unclean domestic animal. A kid and not a wild animal. A kid and not a fowl. So rather than just simply refer to a discussion in the Talmud, he has actually cited it for us. Elsewhere, okay, when he talks about the commentaries, right, we'll get to that in a moment, but as an example, okay, he does tell us, again, cites the sages of the Talmud, okay, and were we to look at a source, it would tell us, again, back in the Gemara of Chulin, okay, clearly which animals are referred to. In a Mishnah on 113a in the Gemara Talmud, okay, we find the Mishnah tells us, Basar behema tahora, the meat of a pure or kosher animal, bechalev behema tahora, in the milk of a pure or kosher animal. Asur levashel, it's forbidden to eat, to cook. Va'asur bahana, it's forbidden to derive benefit. The Mishnah continues. Basar behema tahora, the meat of a pure or kosher animal. Bechalav behema tmeya, in the milk of a impure, non-kosher animal. Basar behema tmeya, the meat of an impure animal. Bechalav behema tahora, in the milk of a kosher animal. Mutar levashel, that's permitted to cook. Umutar bahana, and it's permitted to derive benefit. Now, the Mishnah continued. Rabbi Akiva says, Chayav va'of einan min haTorah. Okay, a non-domestic animal and a bird is not included in this, excuse me, Torah law. So the Mishnah itself, okay, found in the Talmud there on 113, as we said, clearly tells us, okay, again, trying to define which animals are permitted, which animals are not. Now, not that he is satisfied, our author, with citing the Talmud. At times we know the Talmud does not give a final legal statement. Sometimes it does, but there are times that it does not. So what do we have? We then have to go to later authorities. Those are who we call the Rishonim, the early authorities. Okay? Some of them are found in the back of the Talmud, okay? Like, for example, Rabbi Alfazi, okay, the Rif, or some like the Rosh, okay? Right? Those are found there in the back of a large Talmud verse. But there are other Rishonim, early authorities, that wrote their own books determining laws. One that we're most familiar with and that our author tends to cite on a more regular basis is Maimonides in his book, the Mishnah Torah. And that's what he begins to tell us, okay, in another statement. He says, in the view of some of the authorities, okay, so in other words, he's going to cite for us in a moment the view of Maimonides, the sages also imposed an obligation about them. Besides this prohibition, okay, to wait between eating them, in other words, to wait between eating something that's meat and something that's dairy, and eating cheese, something that's eating dairy, and then eating meat, as there is about the main forbidden kind. Okay, the same way that they made regulations about meat of a domestic kosher animal being mixed with the milk. So an example would be from Maimonides. Okay, in the Mishnah Torah, chapter 9, we find the laws of forbidden foods. Okay, at the last example, note law number 28 in that chapter, we find that Maimonides writes as follows: Mi she'achal basar b'tchila, one who ate meat initially, bein basar behema, bein basar of, whether it is the meat of a domestic animal or the meat of a bird, lo yochal acharav chalav, one should not eat after it milk, ad shehiyeh beinehem kedei shi'ur seudah acheret, until enough time has passed for another meal. Now, we won't go into that in detail, but I'll share with you, the Rambam continues, V'hu kemo sheisha'ot, and that is approximately similar to 6 hours. Now remember, Rambam is looking at the model from the Talmud, where people generally ate only 2 meals a day. Okay? They ate what we would call brunch, okay, 11 o'clock, say, and then they would eat towards nightfall. That's why on Shabbat we had Seudah Shlishit, the third meal. Why? Mipnei habasar shel bein hashinayim, explains Rambam. Why? Because it's very possible that by having the meat, okay, it still remains in a person's teeth. She'eno sar b'kinuach, because it's not always possible to remove it with proper manner.
Oh,
Okay? Of course,
Whoa.
today you might argue, well, we have flossing, we have all sorts of activities, but still, that was at least the answer, one of the answers given the answer given by Rambam, and one of the answers given by other authorities as well. And so our author of the Sefer HaMitzvot wants us to understand that there is this possibility, okay, of mixing and milk being consumed even when it doesn't occur at the very same meal. And that's what he's trying to convey. Okay?
Whoa.
Okay, because if the milk became mixed into meat, and the piece of meat into which it was mixed does not contain 60 times the amount of the milk, he's now going into a little bit more rabbinic requirement, that how do we nullify a certain amount? And the footnote of our text tells us what that is, 1 in 60. Some of us may be familiar with the concept. It's called Batul Bashishim, a 1 in 60 ratio. Okay. Otherwise, that would consider the item null and void. Okay. And so what he has continued then to show us as we go on a little bit further is this would be comparable to other kinds of forbidden items, such as eating the nevela, the carrion or the corpse of a dead animal. But where I want us to look here, okay, is very clearly, again, citing once more from the Talmud, okay, that the Torah forbade meat in milk only if it was mixed with milk from a living animal. But if it was with milk from a dead animal, it does not become forbidden. Now, why did he have to suddenly bring this up? This seems to be extraneous, okay? But it's really not the case, because he wants to tell us that there are some parts of an animal. Okay, in this case,
I lost it.
he's pointing to the example of the udder. Okay, that's permissible by Torah law with its milk. Okay, but the sages forbade it as a protective restriction, right? What we call a siyag, the Torah, a fence around the Torah. Okay, until its milk is washed out of it. And he said he'll explain that elsewhere. Finally, as we begin to conclude this particular topic, he always does some discussion of the application. It remains in force in every place, at every time. So in other words, it's not a time-bound mitzvah, only appropriate, say, at meal times. It's important all the time. Secondly, okay, does it only apply to certain people? It applies both for men and for women. And so that, again, is another clear application of the law. However, he goes on to try to clarify that application. Because what about the amount of this mixture? Is there a certain measure by which one would then be considered having transgressed the law? And that's what he wants to convey. If someone transgresses it and eats the amount of an olive of meat and milk, In other words, it's a measure. Some piece has to be at least the size of an olive, and that they were cooked together. He tells us if it was deliberate, okay, what happens? One would get, there we go. One would get flagellation, whiplash, malchus. But he said in that case, if he merely benefited from it, for example, he gave it as a gift or he sold it, that would not result in the punishment, because that's really not consumption. Or he took the example, rubbed some of it on himself. He used it as a medicinal purposes. Okay? This, he says, is a use unlike the usual manner of benefiting from it, as it is not usually put on as a salve. And so we see here in this particular example, okay, how taking the verse, using the discussions of various aspects in the Talmud, and in this case, adding some of those discussions added by later authorities, early authorities, okay, that are after the Talmud, but not, let's say, post-Middle Ages, okay, that he's been able to present, okay, how this particular commandment is to be observed. So we're going to stop here for today. I wish everybody well, and thank you all for participating today.
Thank you.
And
Yes, you're welcome.
look forward to our getting together